Richard Harrison stood in the doorway of his living room, frozen. His hands trembled as he watched the scene before him. There on the sofa sat Maria, their housekeeper for the past 3 years. She wore her usual orange work uniform with yellow cleaning gloves. A blue towel draped over her shoulder, but it wasn't her presence that stopped Richard's heart. It was his son. 7-year-old Tommy sat facing Maria, his bald head catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows. The boy's thin frame seemed so fragile in his gray sweater. But his face was lit with pure joy as he gazed up at Maria. "I'm going to live, Mommy?" Tommy's voice carried such hope that Richard felt his throat tighten. Maria's dark eyes glistened with tears as she gently cradled the ultrasound wand against Tommy's neck. On the monitor beside them, an image flickered, though Richard couldn't make sense of what it showed. "Yes, sweetheart," Maria said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You're going to live!" Richard's mind reeled back to 6 months earlier, to the day that had shattered his world. The diagnosis had come from Dr. Pemberton first, then Dr. Chen, Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. Abrams, Dr. Whitmore, 5 of the most respected oncologists in the country, and they had all said the same thing. The tumor wrapped around Tommy's spinal cord was inoperable, untreatable, fatal. 2 months, they had told him, their faces grave. Maybe 3 if we're fortunate. "Make him comfortable. Spend time with him. We're so very sorry." Richard had spared no expense. He'd flown Tommy to specialists across the nation. He'd offered blank checks to research hospitals. He'd begged, pleaded, demanded answers. His wealth, his power, his connections, none of it mattered. Money couldn't buy what didn't exist. The tumor was too intertwined with Tommy's nervous system. One wrong move and Tommy would be paralyzed or worse. The doctors explained it with charts and scans, their voices calm and professional. But all Richard heard was a death sentence for his only child. Tommy's mother had passed away when he was just 2, taken by a sudden illness Richard still couldn't talk about. Now he was going to lose Tommy too. The injustice of it burned in his chest every waking moment. Maria had come into their lives a year before the diagnosis. Richard barely remembered hiring her. His assistant had handled it. She was quiet, competent, and kind to Tommy. That was all that mattered. But after the diagnosis, something shifted. Maria didn't treat Tommy like a dying child. She didn't speak to him in hushed, pitying tones. She laughed with him. She told him stories about her own childhood in rural Pennsylvania, about catching fireflies and climbing trees. She brought him homemade soup when the pain kept him from eating. "Mr. Harrison," she had said one evening, about a month after the diagnosis, "may I ask you something?" Richard had been sitting in his study, staring at medical reports he'd read 100 times, searching for hope that wasn't there. "What is it, Maria? Have the doctors done an ultrasound? A detailed one of the tumor itself?" He'd looked up, exhausted. "They've done every scan imaginable. MRI, CT, PET scans, everything." Maria had nodded slowly, her dark brow furrowed. "But ultrasound can sometimes show things the other scans miss. The real-time imaging, it's different." Richard had wanted to snap at her. What would a housekeeper know about advanced medical imaging? But something in her steady gaze stopped him. There was no presumption there, no overstepping, just genuine concern. "I'll mention it to Dr. Pemberton," he'd said, turning back to his papers. But he hadn't. What was the point? 5 specialists had reviewed Tommy's case. They knew what they were doing. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Richard's life. Tommy grew weaker. The pain increased. Richard watched his vibrant, curious boy fade a little more each day. Maria stayed late most evenings, sitting with Tommy when Richard couldn't bear it anymore. When the weight of watching his son slip away became too much, she'd read to Tommy or they'd watch old movies together. Sometimes Richard would hear them laughing from Tommy's room, and he'd stand in the hallway, tears streaming down his face, grateful that someone could still bring his son joy. One night, Richard found Maria in the kitchen after Tommy had finally fallen asleep. She was making tea, her movements slow and tired. "You don't have to stay so late," Richard said gently. "I can manage." Maria turned to him, and in her eyes he saw a reflection of his own grief. "He's a special boy, Mr. Harrison. He reminds me of my own son, back when he was that age." Richard hadn't known she had a son. He realized with a flush of shame that he knew almost nothing about Maria's life outside these walls. "He's grown now," Maria continued, pouring water into 2 cups. "He's a doctor, actually. Works in Philadelphia." She paused, her voice growing quieter. "An ultrasound specialist." Something in Richard stirred. "Maria, I called him," she said quickly. "I hope you don't mind. I told him about Tommy, about the tumor." She set down the kettle, her hands shaking slightly. He said he'd like to take a look. No charge, just as a favor. Sometimes, Mr. Harrison, a fresh set of eyes can see what others missed." Richard felt torn between hope and despair. Hope was dangerous. Hope had been crushed 5 times already. But as he looked at Maria's earnest face, at this woman who had shown his son more tenderness than anyone in these dark months, he couldn't refuse. "All right," he whispered. "When?" Dr. Marcus Williams arrived the next afternoon. He was younger than Richard expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He carried a portable ultrasound machine and greeted his mother with a warm embrace. "Thank you for seeing him," Richard said, shaking his hand. "Mom's told me a lot about Tommy," Marcus replied. "I'd like to help if I can." Tommy was nervous at first, but Maria sat beside him, holding his hand as Marcus began the examination. The procedure took over an hour. Marcus was thorough, studying the screen intently, adjusting angles, taking measurements. Finally, he sat back. His expression was unreadable. "Mr. Harrison," he said carefully, "I'd like to show you something." Richard's heart hammered as he approached the monitor. Marcus pointed to a dark mass on the screen, but Richard couldn't interpret what he was seeing. "The tumor is there," Marcus explained, "wrapped around the spinal cord, just as the reports indicated. But look here." He pointed to a thin line, barely visible. "This is a fascial plane, a natural separation in the tissue. It's incredibly thin, which is probably why it didn't show up clearly on the other scans. The angle of the MRI, the resolution, it's easy to miss." "What does that mean?" Richard's voice came out as a rasp. Marcus turned to look at him. "It means there's a pathway. It would be delicate work, incredibly delicate. But I believe the tumor can be removed." The room spun. Richard gripped the edge of the sofa. "Are you certain?" "I'd want to consult with a neurosurgeon I trust," Marcus said carefully. "But yes, Mr. Harrison, I think your son can be saved." That had been 2 weeks ago. The surgery had happened 3 days ago. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the neurosurgeon Marcus recommended, had spent 11 hours removing the tumor, following that thin pathway Marcus had discovered. The operation was successful. Complete removal. No damage to the spinal cord. Tommy would live. And now, here was Maria, showing Tommy the post-operative ultrasound, letting him see with his own eyes that the tumor was gone. "I'm going to live, Mommy?" The word hit Richard. Like a thunderbolt. Mommy. Tommy was calling Maria Mommy. Maria caught Richard's eye over Tommy's head. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "I'm not your mommy." "Sweetheart," she said gently, "but I love you just as much." Tommy turned and saw his father in the doorway. "Dad, did you see? The bad thing is gone!" Richard crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled his son into his arms. "Careful of the bandages." "I see it, buddy. I see it." Over Tommy's head, he met Maria's eyes. No words were adequate. She had advocated for his son when he'd been too broken to think clearly. She had trusted her instincts, reached out to her son, and in doing so, had saved Tommy's life. "Thank you," Richard whispered, knowing it could never be enough. Maria smiled through her tears, removing her yellow gloves and setting them aside. "He's going to need time to heal. Physical therapy, patience." "We have time now," Richard said, his voice breaking. "Thanks to you, we have time." In the months that followed, Tommy's recovery was steady. He regained his strength, his hair grew back, and his laughter once again filled the house. Richard promoted Maria to household manager, though she protested she was happy as she was. He also established a foundation in her name, funding research into advanced ultrasound imaging for pediatric oncology. But more importantly, Maria became part of their family. She joined them for dinners, for weekend outings, for the quiet evenings when Tommy wanted to watch movies or play board games. On Tommy's 8th birthday, 6 months after his surgery, Richard found Maria in the kitchen preparing Tommy's favorite chocolate cake. "You know," Richard said, leaning against the counter, I spent 6 months trying to save my son with money and connections. I thought that's what mattered, power, resources. Maria looked up from the mixing bowl. And what matters, Mr. Harrison? This, he said simply, gesturing around them. Paying attention, caring. Having the courage to speak up even. When you're not sure you'll be heard, he paused. You saw my son. Really saw him. Not as a case or a statistic, but as a child who deserved every chance. Maria's eyes softened. Every child deserves that, Mr. Harrison. Richard, he corrected gently. Please, after everything, call me Richard. She smiled. Every child deserves that, Richard. From the living room came Tommy's voice, calling for both of them. They found him on the sofa, a wrapped present in his lap, his eyes bright with excitement. As Richard watched his son tear into the wrapping paper, Maria standing beside him with that same warm smile, he understood something profound. The greatest gifts in life couldn't be bought. They came from open hearts, from people who cared enough to act, from the quiet kindness of someone who saw what others missed. His son had been given a second chance at life, not because of wealth or power, but because a housekeeper had the wisdom to trust her instincts and the courage to speak up. Sometimes Richard realized the most unlikely people bring the greatest miracles, and sometimes the greatest wisdom comes not from those with the most credentials, but from those with the most heart.